Tonight we begin with a development that us officials had feared, dismissed, and ultimately prepared for. A shift in the balance of power that unfolded not over years but in months. Months that exposed Putin's military as hollow. Months that transformed Ukraine into America's most effective strategic partner. Months that rewrote the rules of modern warfare. What Ukraine did in Kherson crossed a line that Russia had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Washington did not hesitate. They responded with precision, coordination, and overwhelming support. For years now, there had been signals not from official channels, not from formal intelligence reports, just signals that Ukraine was preparing something unprecedented. Ukraine has been resilient, yes, but they have been strategic in their resilience. Their moves have followed a certain logic, a discipline, almost a choreography. But what set off alarm bells in Moscow that fall was that the choreography went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Ukrainian military activity know the indicators. The troop movements toward the south, the supply chain adjustments, the sudden surge in Western equipment deliveries, the quiet withdrawal of civilians from the front, all of that went quiet. And whenever Ukraine goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Early in November 2022, US intelligence detected what they described as a massive repositioning of Ukrainian forces, including troop concentrations that had not been observed in over 8 months. These are the kinds of formations that Ukraine only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: a major offensive, a strategic liberation, or a decisive turning point. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Ukraine was changing its posture. And when an underestimated military shifts posture without explanation, even by a few kilometers, the Pentagon pays attention. The assessment issued by US defense officials that November was not normal, it was not routine, it was not symbolic, it was urgent. Source after source in classified briefings described Russia's position in Kherson as untenable, logistically impossible, and perhaps most importantly, strategically catastrophic for Putin's entire war narrative. But Russian intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response throughout the fall was among the most disciplined we've seen in modern warfare. Within hours of detecting Russian supply line vulnerabilities, Ukraine struck with precision. These weren't the symbolic attacks of the early war. These were systematic destruction campaigns, HIMARS systems, and Western artillery that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to liberate territory permanently. Throughout October and November, multiple sources confirmed that Ukraine launched coordinated strikes on Russian logistics, including the Antonovsky Bridge that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was a last-ditch resupply effort. Ukraine struck before Russia could establish alternative routes. They hit ammunition depots, they hit command posts, they hit ferry crossings that were likely preparing to support a defensive consolidation. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's occupation, the logistics infrastructure that would have made retreat organized. This is what made the Pentagon's assessment so urgent. Russia's position in Kherson wasn't just vulnerable, it was collapsing. It represented the kind of defeat that could cascade across the entire front if left unaddressed. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't push into kill zones, they didn't overextend their lines, they hit Russian supplies, they hit Russian morale. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Pentagon analysts now believe that Russia's retreat from Kherson was designed to test the cohesion of Western support after months of economic pressure. Putin wanted to see whether NATO would fragment over a prolonged conflict. But instead, the opposite happened. Washington didn't waver. They accelerated weapons deliveries that were so rapid, so comprehensive, that even Moscow noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily, but that fall, Ukraine did. A defense official speaking with Western media under anonymity described Putin's Kherson withdrawal as humiliation, a way to preserve forces while conceding strategic defeat. But Ukraine proved that fall that they remain both lethal and patient. Their operations were not only effective, they were calibrated so precisely that Russian forces couldn't even execute an orderly retreat. That precision matters because it shows something Washington had only hoped for. It shows that Ukraine is not just a recipient of aid, they are a force multiplier. As reports continued coming in throughout November, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's achievement. Ukrainian ground forces carried out systematic advances, forcing Russian abandonment of the only regional capital they had captured. Ukrainian artillery targeted supply depots that had been established in the last 6 months. Ukrainian drones operating across the Dnipro reportedly destroyed pontoon crossings used by Russia to evacuate equipment. This wasn't just tactical success, this wasn't just territorial recovery. This was strategic humiliation. This was proof of concept, and proof of concept is the one thing Putin has struggled to maintain since February 24th. For every advance Russia has made, Ukraine has countered with something that makes that advance meaningless. Remember, Putin thought Ukraine would collapse in 3 days. He thought Kyiv would fall by the end of February. He thought NATO would fracture under energy pressure. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is stronger than ever. NATO is more unified than at any point since the Cold War, and Russia is bleeding troops, equipment, and credibility every single day. What makes this moment so dangerous and so pivotal is that Ukraine's Kherson victory happened at a time when Putin is under unprecedented domestic pressure. Military hardliners want escalation. Economic pragmatists want negotiation. Regional governors want their mobilized soldiers back. His inner circle wants someone to blame. Putin is balancing these demands while watching his special military operation become the largest military failure in Russia's modern history. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The Pentagon's assessment, now shared with congressional leaders, was designed to signal that Washington is not willing to allow Russian reconsolidation. Officials said plainly that Russia's conduct in Kherson was inconsistent with any legitimate military objective. That is diplomatic language for they committed war crimes while retreating, and we have the evidence. You don't usually hear that tone from the Defense Department unless something serious is at stake. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky addressed his nation in a powerful, emotional speech that November night. He said, "We are returning Kherson to Ukraine. This is our city." He said the occupiers fled. They left behind destruction, but they could not take our spirit. And he said, "This is what happens when a nation fights for its freedom." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's retreat from Kherson wasn't isolated. Along with their territorial loss, Russian forces also intensified missile strikes on civilian infrastructure. Wagner Group expanded recruitment from prisons and psychiatric facilities. Russian state media increased nuclear rhetoric targeting Western audiences. All of this happened within the same month. When Putin moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. Analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing for a long winter of attrition, hoping Western support fades. Another is that Putin is attempting to freeze the conflict along current lines before more losses occur. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to use the winter energy crisis to break European solidarity. But that winter, Ukraine and its partners took that card off the table. They didn't reduce weapons flows, they didn't pause sanctions, they didn't negotiate from weakness, they doubled down. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see if the West will tire. Ukraine wants to show that freedom is worth any price. Washington wants to prevent Russian victory, and Europe wants to prevent energy blackmail from succeeding. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence officials who are now monitoring Russian repositioning. They say morale among Russian forces has collapsed. They say equipment losses are approaching catastrophic levels. Our top buy date and they say Putin's decision to retreat from Kherson is likely part of a broader strategy intended to preserve what forces remain. But Ukraine is not celebrating prematurely. In fact, Ukraine is preparing for the next phase. Their response throughout this conflict, disciplined, lethal, and unyielding, sent a message to Moscow that retreat does not mean safety, and it sent a message to Washington that every dollar invested is being used effectively. As the months go on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with his failed occupation. But what we do know is that Ukraine's liberation of Kherson was transformative. It proved that Russia can be beaten. It proved that Western weapons work. And it proved that Ukraine is the most effective anti-Putin force on the planet. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the coming months. If they escalate further, this moment will be remembered as the turning point that made escalation inevitable. If they attempt to negotiate, Ukraine and its partners have already shown they are operating from a position of strength. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time since the war began, Russia appears to be genuinely uncertain. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet. Too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means they are calculating. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because that fall, Russia learned something they have learned many times before. Ukraine will not surrender. The West will not abandon them. And every attempt to subjugate a free nation only strengthens their resolve. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Ukraine has become America's most valuable strategic partner against authoritarianism. Kherson proved that the impossible is achievable. And Vladimir Putin's imperial ambitions are crumbling one city at a time. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.